She was humiliated in front of everyone, on her knees, while they laughed at her. No one imagined that among the customers was the true owner of the bar, a millionaire in disguise, about to learn the greatest lesson of his life. What began as a night of shame would soon become a turning point the world would never forget. Subscribe to Fire Story, because some humiliations hide powerful new beginnings. There was something strange about that cold night in Boston. The lights of the Blue Harbor reflected on the wet sidewalk, as if time itself were crying for what that place had become. Jackson Cole, the man who had built that empire from nothing, walked through the front door wearing simple clothes, a worn-out cap, and a curious look. No one recognized him. The billionaire moved quietly among the tables and artificial laughter, trying to understand where the heart of his business had been lost. It was like visiting an old house and realizing that the scent of warmth had been replaced by cheap perfume and arrogance. He had always believed that respect was the secret to success, but now, without even realizing it, something had broken inside that place. Something invisible, yet essential. The bar, once a symbol of joy and good memories, now breathed a heavy air. Waiters rushed by with dark circles under their eyes and short, nervous steps, like people afraid to make a mistake. A group of customers complained loudly, and no one listened. The manager, a man in a neatly pressed suit and an overinflated ego, just watched with disdain, as if everyone there were replaceable. Jackson sat quietly in a corner and ordered a coffee, the same coffee he used to serve himself years ago, when he was young and dreamed of a better life. He sat there in silence, watching the sad show of indifference unfold. The humiliation wasn't in the words, but in the absence of them, in the silence of disrespect. As he waited, he remembered the day he founded the Blue Harbor. He could still see the opening night, when he, unaware of what success would demand, washed glasses, served customers, and thanked each one personally. It was a time when a smile was worth more than profit, and simple work had real value. Now, he saw the opposite, a cold environment where laughter sounded mechanical and humility had gone out of style. When money goes to the head, the heart goes to the pocket, he thought. The worst part. His name was still shining above the door. The millionaire found himself staring at his own shadow, and he didn't like what he saw. Suddenly, a waiter stumbled and dropped a tray. The entire bar turned to look at him. The manager muttered something under his breath without even standing up. Jackson felt his throat tighten. That moment was a perfect reflection of what he himself had become, someone distant, judging without listening, managing numbers and forgetting people. The employee's humiliation was the mirror of his own invisible failure. Not financial, moral. He knew that respect couldn't be bought, it had to be cultivated. And without knowing it, that moment began to stir something inside him. The disguise was perfect. No one imagined that the bearded man in the corner with a cap pulled low was the founder of the place. And maybe that was for the best. Because it's only when no one recognizes us that we start to truly see. Jackson noticed the small details, the spirit of the bar slipping away. The loud music drowned out kind voices. The rush killed the care. Profit had become the new god, and humanity, just a detail. This is where respect died, he murmured, half in anger, half in sorrow. A couple argued at the next table. The waiter tried to help and was ignored. A rude customer pushed a chair aside and complained loudly without even looking at the person serving him. Jackson's blood boiled. He remembered when customers used to call him by name and said they'd come back because of how they were treated. Now, everything felt empty, plastic, rehearsed. The millionaire realized with bitterness that the empire he built was collapsing from the inside, not financially, but morally. And the cruelest part. He was only realizing it now, disguised as a nobody. It was nearly midnight. The smell of fried food mixed with cheap cologne. The loud music made the floor shake, but what hurt the most was the silence in the employee's eyes, a tiredness that screamed louder than any sound. Jackson watched every gesture, every failed attempt at kindness, and began to understand. The problem wasn't the bar itself, but the culture that had taken root there. The lack of empathy was the real virus, corroding everything he had worked so hard to build. And worst of all, it was all happening under his name. At one point, a waiter stopped by his table and asked with a forced smile, "Would you like anything else, sir?" Jackson shook his head, noticing the young man's trembling hands. "No, thank you," he replied quietly. And inside, he wondered, how much does he make per night to put up with this? That question would haunt him for a long time, an open wound he couldn't ignore. The billionaire pulled out his phone, pretending to scroll, just to hide the moisture in his eyes. The disguise protected him, but it also shamed him. He wanted to stand up, to shout, to do something. But he knew he had to keep watching. To truly fix it, he needed to understand the roots of that quiet decay. After all, empires don't crumble overnight. They erode slowly, with every small act of neglect, every "it's not my problem" spoken by someone who should have cared. And there, among fake laughter and tired eyes, Jackson began the first steps of his own redemption. Curiously, even amid the chaos, something in his heart still believed there were good people left in that place, that someone still carried the spark the Blue Harbor once had. He just didn't know he was about to meet her. He didn't know that a tired, invisible waitress was about to teach him the greatest lesson of his life. And that night, without realizing it, fate began to prepare the encounter that would change everything. Among the many faces dulled by routine, one stood out. Ruby Johnson, 26 years old, single mother, heart of steel and soul of cotton. Every day she walked into the Blue Harbor with the same smile, not the trained one meant to please customers, but the genuine kind that comes from someone who chooses to stay kind even on stormy days. Jackson noticed her right away. There was something about her that clashed with the cynicism of the place. While others complained, Ruby said, "It's okay, tomorrow will be better." And when the manager frowned at a mistake, she answered with a soft, "I'm sorry, sir," that carried more dignity than submission. Without knowing it, she was being watched by the man who had the power to change her life. Ruby had the eyes of someone who had faced the world alone. She raised her little boy, Malik, on a salary just enough to survive. But what truly kept her standing was something invisible: faith. She had a habit of writing little notes with quotes and keeping them in her apron pocket. Kindness doesn't cost much. Humility is strength that learned to stay quiet. And ironically, it was in that same bar that she faced every day the opposite of what she believed in: arrogance, shouting, and glances that passed through her as if she were part of the furniture. The world can be cruel to those who smile too much, but Ruby refused to harden her heart. From his corner, Jackson watched everything with growing discomfort. There was a kind of humiliation that didn't come from words, but from subtle gestures, like the way the manager rolled his eyes when Ruby asked for help, or the mocking laughs of customers who made her repeat orders just to test her patience. And she, even wounded, answered with kindness. That hit Jackson in a strange way. He, the millionaire used to being served, had never stopped to think about the weight behind a tired smile. The lesson was already being taught, and he didn't even know it. That night, a group of executives walked in, laughing loudly, demanding tables and attention. Their voices were drunk on power, their egos inflated by privilege. Ruby rushed to serve them, balancing trays and patience. "Sir, can I bring you something to start with?" she asked politely. "You can start by learning how to walk properly," one of them sneered, earning loud laughter from the table. The manager pretended not to hear, staring at his phone. Jackson felt his stomach turn. He was seeing, with his own eyes, the exact image of what money should never buy: the right to humiliate. Ruby, for a brief moment, thought about crying. But she held her breath and smiled, the kind of smile that feels like armor. The humiliation burned inside her, but she knew losing her composure would mean giving victory to those who didn't deserve it. There were bills to pay, a child waiting at home, and a heart that still believed dignity didn't need applause. Jackson watched her and thought about how many Rubis had passed through that bar before, invisible women, swallowing insults out of fear of losing their jobs. And then the truth hit him hard: he had once been that kind of man too, the one who saw but didn't act. The breaking point came minutes later. A glass slipped from Ruby's tray and shattered on the floor. The sharp sound of glass echoed like a gunshot. Every head turned. "Useless!" one of the executives shouted. "If you knew how to work, you wouldn't just be a waitress." Laughter spread through the room. The manager laughed along, finding amusement in the humiliation. Ruby lowered her head, her face flushed, heart pounding. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was pain. Jackson took a deep breath. Anger rose in him, hot and silent. How could respect be worth so little in this place? He wanted to stand up, reveal who he was, and throw them all out. But something stopped him. Maybe it was Ruby's eyes, that quiet light he recognized from years ago, when he had also been humiliated by someone in power. It was like looking in a mirror. Jackson realized he was watching his own story unfold again, only this time from the other side of the table. And life, in its perfect irony, was teaching him, money can hide your face, but it can't protect your conscience. Ruby took a deep breath. She grabbed a cloth, knelt down, and began to clean the floor. The silence was heavy. The manager watched, satisfied. One of the executives sneered. "Look at her, that's where she belongs." Jackson almost stood up, but he restrained himself. He needed to see how far this would go. And that's when it happened. Something small, yet monumental. Ruby stopped cleaning. She froze for a few seconds, as if searching deep inside herself for some ancient strength. Then she lifted her head, looked straight at the man who had insulted her, and spoke in a firm voice, the words that would make history. The entire bar seemed to freeze when she said, "Dignity doesn't beg." 3 words. That was all. But each syllable carried the weight of every tear she had ever swallowed. Jackson felt a chill run down his spine. The sound echoed inside him, as if God himself had used that woman to remind him of something he'd long forgotten. The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but it felt like eternity. The manager looked away. One of the executives lowered his head. The shame had finally changed sides. Jackson couldn't explain it, but something inside him shifted at that exact moment. It was as if Ruby's soul had crossed the air and touched his. Those 3 words, simple, raw, true, shattered all the armor that money had built around his heart. And as Ruby went back to work, trying to hide the trembling of her hands, he understood. He was looking at the woman who would teach him the true meaning of respect. What would happen the next day? No one in that bar would ever forget. The sound of breaking glass still hung in the air when the manager pointed at Ruby and barked, "Clean it up. Now." His voice was cold, almost mechanical, the tone of someone giving an order to a machine, not a human being. Ruby took a deep breath. Her face burned, her hands shook, her heart raced. It was just another night, another humiliation. But this time, something inside her was different. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the limit. She knelt down on the cold floor of the Blue Harbor, surrounded by muffled laughter and eyes that turned away in shame. And it was there, right where dignity seemed to collapse, that something unexpected began, the silent rebuilding of a woman tired of staying quiet. The floor was cold, and the rag felt heavy as stone. Ruby cleaned the broken glass slowly, holding back tears. The whole bar watched. One of the drunken executives threw out the cruel line that sliced through the air. "See, that's her place." Laughter erupted again, and Jackson felt his blood boil. He, the billionaire in disguise, never imagined he would witness such cruelty inside his own business. Every laugh was a knife twisting in the memory of the man who once served tables with humility. Ruby, still on her knees, paused for a moment. The cloth trembled in her hands. Then she lifted her head, and her eyes, once wet, now burned like fire. Humiliation had turned into something stronger. "Dignity doesn't beg." The words came out like thunder, steady, clear, almost sacred. The entire bar went silent. The sound of glasses, conversations, the music, everything stopped. Only the echo of her words remained, hanging in the air like a verdict. Jackson sat frozen, staring at the woman who, without even knowing it, had just given him the most powerful lesson of his entire career. It was a simple phrase, but it carried the weight of a universal truth. It wasn't about pride, it was about faith, about strength, about the cry of everyone who had ever been humiliated and still chose to keep their self-respect. The manager tried to cover his embarrassment by coughing, pretending nothing had happened. But his mask had fallen. Ruby stood up slowly, looked around, and said calmly, "I can clean the floor, sir, but not the conscience of those who step on others." Jackson swallowed hard. It was as if time had stopped. The people who had been laughing now shrank into silence. The whole bar felt smaller in the presence of that simple woman's greatness. And for the first time in many years, the millionaire felt shame, not for others, but for himself. Shame for forgetting where he came from. Shame for losing touch with the humanity that had built his success. As Ruby walked back toward the kitchen, Jackson's eyes followed her. The knot in his throat tightened. He thought of his mother, who had worked in a diner for 30 years and used to say, "Money buys comfort, not character." Now, sitting there behind a cheap disguise, he saw those words come alive before him. In just a few minutes, Ruby had become the mirror of everything he had lost. And deep down, he knew, he couldn't let this pass. Some customers started whispering. Others, embarrassed, left money on the tables and walked out. The air felt lighter, but the moral weight was enormous. Jackson closed his eyes for a second, feeling truth pulse in his chest. That scene wasn't just about a waitress and a group of arrogant men. It was about an entire system that fed on the hierarchy of humiliation. He knew that if he stayed silent, he'd be complicit. But he also knew that if he revealed who he was right then, no one would truly understand the value of the lesson they had just witnessed. In the kitchen, Ruby leaned against the sink and took a deep breath. Her hands were trembling, but her heart was calm. She knew she might lose her job, but she didn't care. Some losses cleanse the soul. "Dignity doesn't beg," she whispered to herself like a mantra. Outside, Jackson slowly stood up, left a few bills on the table, and walked out. But his mind was burning. He knew that the next day, everything would change. Not just for Ruby, but for everyone. That night, as he drove through the empty streets of Boston, the millionaire replayed the scene in his mind again and again. Her words echoed like a melody impossible to forget. Dignity doesn't beg. How many times had he himself forgotten that? How many times had he allowed the culture of profit to erase respect? Life, he thought, has a curious way of teaching lessons. Sometimes, it uses the most unlikely messengers, a tired waitress, to remind the powerful that greatness lies not in commanding, but in serving. At home, Ruby hugged her son Malik as tears rolled down her face. He asked why she was crying, and she simply said, "Mom learned today that telling the truth hurts, but it sets you free." Malik, not fully understanding, smiled and pressed his cheek against hers. Meanwhile, across town, Jackson opened his laptop, scrolling through reports and remembering her words. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about profits or goals, he was thinking about people. And before the sun even rose, he had already decided. The next day, everyone would know who he really was, and what he had witnessed that night. The next morning, the atmosphere at Blue Harbor was strange. There was something in the air, a tense silence, an invisible sense of expectation. The manager paced back and forth, uneasy. The executives who had been at the table the night before still laughed about the scene, as if recalling some cruel spectacle. Ruby arrived early, as always. Her body was tired, but her gaze was steady. She didn't expect applause or pity, just another day of work. Little did she know that Tuesday would change everything. Jackson Cole, the man everyone had ignored, hadn't slept all night. And now, the billionaire in disguise was about to reveal who he truly was. At exactly 10 o'clock, the second-floor conference room was ready. Glass walls, the smell of fresh coffee, and a long table gave the room an air of authority. The manager entered first, smiling, unaware of what awaited him. The executives followed, still joking about the waitress who dared to talk back. Ruby was called in by a messenger, and frowned in confusion. She had never been invited to a management meeting before. When she stepped into the room, she saw the man from the night before, no longer wearing a cap, but standing tall in a perfectly tailored gray suit. Time seemed to freeze. The manager raised his eyebrows, confused. "Good morning," Jackson said, calm but firm. I believe we have a few things to discuss. The manager laughed awkwardly. And you are? Jackson took a badge from his pocket and placed it on the table. The name gleamed in gold, Jackson Cole, CEO, Blue Harbor Group. The air was sucked out of the room. The executives exchanged pale glances. Ruby stood frozen. The manager turned so white he looked like he'd seen a ghost. I'm the man you ignored last night, Jackson continued, his voice steady. The customer who watched one of your employees being humiliated, inside a company that bears my name. The silence was almost physical. No one dared breathe. Jackson walked to the window. Morning light illuminated half his face, leaving the other in shadow. I built this place with my own hands, he said. And last night, for the first time, I was ashamed to walk into it. He looked directly at the manager. You laughed while a customer insulted a woman who was just doing her job. The man stammered, trying to defend himself. Sir, it was a misunderstanding, she. Enough, Jackson interrupted. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a lack of character. The words hit like stones. One of the executives tried to speak, but Jackson raised a hand for silence. He didn't need to shout. His authority spoke for him. Ruby stood there, still in shock, her heart pounding, unsure if this was justice or a dream. Jackson turned to her and said, Yesterday, you reminded me of something I'd forgotten, why I started all this in the first place. His tone softened. This bar wasn't built to serve drinks. It was built to serve respect. Ruby didn't reply. She just took a deep breath, her eyes glistening. The manager tried to explain himself again, but Jackson cut him off with one sentence. You're fired. The decision cracked through the room like a whip. The man lowered his head and left without a word. Nothing he could say would erase what he had allowed to happen. Then Jackson turned to Ruby. As for you, he began, I want you to know that what you did yesterday was brave. She lowered her eyes, unsure what to say. I didn't do anything special, sir. I just didn't want to lose myself to please others. Jackson smiled faintly. Exactly. People like you are rare. He then placed a folder with the company's logo on the table. Starting today, you're the new service coordinator. I want you to teach this team what real dignity means. Ruby was speechless. Tears came before words. One of the executives, still uneasy, muttered, With all due respect, Mr. Cole, she doesn't even have a degree. Jackson cut him off with a firm look. The best education anyone can have is character. Silence filled the room once again. Ruby wiped her tears, overwhelmed. The weight of years of struggle and invisibility seemed to lift off her shoulders. Jackson continued. I've always said that Blue Harbor's bars are about people, not profits. And you reminded me of that when you said, dignity doesn't beg. Those words will stay here, he tapped his chest, and in every one of our establishments. Ruby tried to thank him, but her voice broke. She simply placed a hand over her heart and nodded. Jackson smiled softly, understanding what silence can say. In that moment, something inside him healed. The man who had everything realized he was missing something essential, humanity. And it was the simplest woman in the room who had given it back to him. Outside, the sun was high. People hurried past on the street, unaware that inside, at that very moment, a new story was being born. One about respect, forgiveness, and second chances. As everyone left the room, Ruby looked at her reflection in the window. She no longer saw just a waitress, she saw a woman who had learned to rise from her knees. Jackson, meanwhile, stayed behind, staring at the manager's badge left on the table. He smiled, bittersweet. Justice isn't about revenge, it's about restoration. And he knew that from now on, nothing would ever be the same. But what would come next would be greater than any of them could imagine. Months passed since that morning in Boston, but Blue Harbor was never the same again. The walls that once witnessed arrogance and indifference now breathed respect and kindness. People came and went with something different in their eyes, a quiet sense of comfort and hope. Ruby walked through the halls with calm confidence, her smile serene, now wearing the new coordinator's uniform. Her badge gleamed, but it was the look in people's eyes that truly reflected the change. She wasn't just supervising service, she was inspiring it. With every gesture, she reminded them, humility is the foundation of any empire that hopes to last forever. Jackson watched everything from afar, proud. The once distant millionaire now made a point of visiting every branch in person, talking with employees, listening to their stories. The secret of success, he finally understood, wasn't in profits, it was in people. The lesson Ruby had given him had become a beacon. And, strangely, he could never hear the words, "Dignity doesn't beg," again without feeling a lump in his throat. The phrase stayed with him as a constant reminder that true power lies in serving, not controlling. The man who had once disguised himself to observe his own empire now revealed a different version of himself. More human, more real. In a short time, Blue Harbor was making headlines, not for its expensive drinks, but for its human service that moved customers and transformed employees. Every location now had a golden-lettered plaque on the wall bearing the words that changed everything, "Dignity doesn't beg." Jackson insisted the sign be placed near the entrance, where everyone could see it, a reminder of why they were there. Some customers asked what it meant, and Ruby, with her calm smile, would answer, "It means respect is what keeps any house standing." Simple words, but no one left without thinking. Ruby became an example for many women. In interviews, she spoke little, with a gentle but steady voice. "I only did what anyone should do," she said. "I fought not to lose myself." She never called herself a hero, but she inspired like one. Journalists loved to call her the waitress who taught a millionaire. She would laugh at that. She didn't see any difference between them. "We're all learning something, in one way or another," she'd say. And she was right. Everyone was learning. Even the former executives, once arrogant, changed their ways. Some personally apologized. Real remorse, something rare, had finally taken root in a place that once breathed only pride. In a press interview, Jackson summed up the transformation with a single sentence that spread across the country. "It was a waitress who taught me what success really means." His honesty disarmed the public. Social media filled with comments, and old videos of the incident resurfaced. But, unlike what many expected, Ruby never sought fame. She didn't give long interviews or try to profit from the story. She kept showing up early, bringing coffee for her coworkers and taking care of the little details no one else noticed. Her light came from what couldn't be seen, character. Over time, Blue Harbor became a model of human-centered leadership. Companies across the country requested talks, and the phrase, "Dignity doesn't beg," began to appear in campaigns about respect and empathy. Ruby, though shy, was invited to speak at a conference for working women. As she stepped onto the stage in a simple blue dress, her heart raced. "I didn't come here to teach anything," she began. "I just want to remind you that the world still needs people who choose kindness, even when no one's watching." The entire audience rose in applause. Jackson, sitting in the front row, discreetly wiped away a tear. The story of Ruby and Jackson spread throughout the country. Books, articles, lectures. Everyone wanted to tell what had happened that night in a bar in Boston. But for both of them, the most beautiful memory remained the same. The night when dignity spoke louder than fear. Life is strange. Sometimes, it's on the floor that we find the strength to rise. And Ruby proved it. Those who keep a clean heart never stay down for long. The world may try to make you kneel, but a soul that knows who it is always stands tall. Years later, when Ruby became head of customer relations for the entire company, Jackson did something symbolic. He had a phrase painted at the main entrance of the group's headquarters. "Sometimes, the one who's on their knees isn't falling, they're rising from within." It was his way of immortalizing the lesson. And every time Ruby walked past it, she felt a warm shiver, a quiet reminder that life rewards those who choose what's right, even when no one's watching. Blue Harbor was no longer just a bar. It had become living proof that humility, when joined with courage, can change destinies. And so, what began as a simple night of work turned into a story of faith, respect, and transformation. Ruby Johnson, the invisible waitress, became a symbol of integrity in a hurried world. Jackson Cole, the disguised billionaire, became an example of humility and leadership. And together, without realizing it, they wrote a chapter no business school could ever teach, the chapter of humanity. And now, if this story touched your heart, like the video, subscribe to Fire Story, and tell us where you're watching from, because stories like this only matter when they reach real hearts.